Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are undertaking a really extensive analysis based on the source material you've provided us.
Yeah.
The fascinating case research gathered in the book True CourtRoom Stories, researched by Mr. Zahir Ahmad Mir.
It's great to be here.
This is episode 133, and we are diving headfirst into, I think, one of the most fundamental yet persistently challenged concepts in law and, frankly, in modern society, the right to privacy.
It's an absolutely essential subject for a deep dive. I mean, particularly because the courtroom stories Mr. Mir has researched, they don't treat privacy as just a single legal clause.
No, it's much more than that.
It's a complex structure, really. It's built on multiple foundations. And our source material gives us these four distinct, really powerful lenses to look at this, right?
And what are those?
We're going from, the core legal maxim that guides judicial thinking through religious morality, then to the demanding world of global standards, and finally right down to specific constitutional applications, especially when they're up against state surveillance.
That's right. So the mission for us today is to really analyze how this concept of personal privacy, and specifically the inviolability of that private sphere, is understood and how it's legally protected across these different frameworks: religious, global, constitutional. And we aren't just summarizing definitions here. We're trying to get to the heart of the jurisprudence, the philosophy, and the practical application that dictates how judges decide where that line is drawn.
Exactly.
We're looking for that ultimate red thread, the one connecting these diverse sources that a judge pulls on when they have to assert, no, the state cannot look here.
And, understanding that foundational philosophy is just so critical for any learner. We're going to start with the ultimate test of privacy, that fundamental ratio that underpins all the legal thought on this.
And then build from there.
And then we'll systematically build the legal and the moral superstructure around it. This is about moving past the idea that privacy is just a collection of rules. It's not. It's about recognizing it as this inherent spirit that protects the individual against the collective power of the state.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's start right at the bedrock. The core legal principle that's derived from these courtroom cases in the book. This is the ultimate red line, isn't it? The one that dictates the legal relationship between a citizen and the state.
It is. It's the foundation for everything that follows.
The core ratio, the litmus test for this entire discussion, is distilled into a single, really profound statement that comes up in the judicial reasoning of these stories. The home is beyond the state's gaze. It's incredibly stark. It's simple.
It is.
My first question is, why that specific phrasing? Why did the judges choose such simple, almost poetic language, beyond the state's gaze, instead of some, complicated legal formula?
Well, they chose that phrasing precisely because of its foundational power.
Wow.
It's in the simplicity. It acts as the ultimate boundary-setting device. It's a clear, unqualified declaration of limited state power.
So it's not ambiguous at all?
Not at all. And the term the home here, it's not just a piece of real estate. It's not just property. It's the physical and psychological archetype of the private sphere.
The sanctuary.
The sanctuary, exactly. It's where identity is formed, where opinions are held freely, and where life's biggest decisions are made without that chilling effect of potential scrutiny. So to declare this space beyond the state's gaze establishes an absolute a prima facie right of autonomy.
Okay, let's break down that term. When you say a prima facie right, you mean the right exists on the face of it automatically, and any challenge to it has to prove some exceptional justification, correct?
Precisely. That's the power of the ratio. It's in its definitive nature and the immediate presumption it creates. If the state wants to violate that space, to cast its gaze upon the home, the burden of justification is exceptionally high.
So the default position is no entry.
The default is no entry. The state has to prove not just that it would be convenient to look, but that there is an overwhelming necessity that supersedes this fundamental ratio. Historically, you can trace this back to the old legal maxim that a man's home is his castle.
Right, I was just thinking that.
But in modern jurisprudence, it's evolved. It's really about limited governance and preserving civil liberties in the face of a much more powerful state.
Let's really analyze what the state's gaze implies in a legal context. It can't just mean physical entry, right? We have warrants for that. In the context of the modern courtroom challenges that Mr. Mir's book documents, what does the gaze actually encompass?
That's the crucial question. It implies any form of sensory intrusion that diminishes the private quality of the home. And this means the law has to constantly evolve.
Because technology evolves.
Exactly. Initially, the gaze just meant visual intrusion, someone physically peering through windows, unauthorized surveillance from a distance. But as the research shows, the gaze now has to encompass the full spectrum of surveillance capabilities.
Such as, what are we talking about here?
Well, think auditorily, for one. Wiretapping, acoustic surveillance of private conversations happening inside those four walls. But in modern terms, the gaze extends way beyond that, into the electromagnetic spectrum.
Okay, so that sounds more advanced.
It is. It includes things like long-distance photography, thermal imaging that can reveal patterns of activity inside the home.
Wow, so it can see heat signatures through walls.
It can. And critically, it also includes electronic surveillance and metadata collection. Now, metadata might not reveal the content of conversation, but it can reveal these incredibly intimate patterns of life lived within the home.
Yeah.
Who you call, when you call them, for how long. The courts are recognizing that modern tech allows the state to cast its gaze without ever needing a physical presence.
So the law recognizes that if the state can see or hear or even just deduce what's happening inside that sanctuary without proper justification, the sanctity is violated. It doesn't matter if boot ever steps over the threshold.
That's it. That is the crucial insight driving modern privacy law.
That sounds terrifyingly relevant today. I mean, we have smart devices, smart speakers in every single room of our houses.
It is deeply relevant. If the state can continuously monitor your life through subtle, pervasive technology, then the home ceases to function as that sanctuary for identity and free thought that the law demands it to be.
And what's the consequence of that?
The essential consequence of being watched is what we call the chilling effect. The moment you believe your actions or your private thoughts are being recorded or scrutinized, your behavior shifts. You start to self-censor.
You don't speak as freely.
You limit free expression, and you ultimately compromise your genuine identity. This ratio is paramount because it protects the very foundation of a free society, which is the uninhibited inner life of the citizen.
This really is the aha moment for understanding judicial thinking on privacy, isn't it? It shifts the entire burden of justification onto the state. A judge isn't starting by asking, does the state have a good reason to look?
No, the starting point is completely different.
They're starting from the position the state must prove, beyond any doubt, why it absolutely must violate this fundamental principle that the home is beyond its gaze. And they have to demonstrate that that violation is the only possible way to achieve some paramount public good.
And this ratio, it acts as the ultimate test case in these courtroom stories. Just imagine a scenario from the research where a piece of evidence, say an electronic record or a photograph gathered from inside a private boundary, is challenged in court.
Okay.
The very first question the judge is asking, either implicitly or explicitly, is, did the gathering of this evidence violate the core principle that the home is beyond the state's gaze? And if the answer is yes,
Then what?
then that evidence is very often ruled inadmissible. It's called fruit of the poisonous tree, regardless of how relevant it might be to proving guilt.
Wait, hold on. Regardless of its relevance, that seems, on the surface, like the law is prioritizing procedure over actually finding justice in a criminal case.
But that's the entire point. It underscores that constitutional integrity is a non-negotiable foundation. If you allow the state to benefit from a constitutional breach, what are you doing?
You're incentivizing more breaches in the future.
You are incentivizing future breaches. By dismissing the evidence, the court reinforces a powerful message. Protecting the constitutional right takes absolute precedence over convenience in prosecution. That ratio isn't just a legal preference, it's the structural foundation of limited government power.
That sets a very strict legal framework. But the courtroom stories that Mr. Muir has documented, they don't just rely on these cold legal definitions. They also seem to draw on something deeper, a moral and cultural imperative, especially in the regional context.
They absolutely do.
And this moves us from that dry legal ratio to a concept with significantly more weight to it, the sanctity of the home.
A very important shift.
So we're moving from the purely legal ratio of beyond the state's gaze, which is really about state constraints, to this religious and cultural basis cited in the sources, the sanctity of home. This seems to give the legal right a kind of moral weight. What is the fundamental difference between legal protection and sanctity in this context?
The difference is profound, really, because they operate on completely different levels.
Yes.
Legal protection, that sets the minimum standard of compliance. It's enforced by the coercive power of the state. It's the what you cannot do.
It's a floor.
It's the floor, exactly. Sanctity, however, implies something much deeper. It implies a sacred, a moral, and a cultural duty to respect the privacy of others. It's the what you should not even want to do. It's a kind of self-imposed restraint that extends way beyond just preventing state intrusion. It guides individual behavior and societal norms.
Okay, so if the legal ratio sets the line for the state, the concept of sanctity is setting a moral baseline for the neighbor, the friend, the colleague, the entire community. It places a moral duty on everyone to proactively protect the private domain of others.
Exactly. And what's fascinating here is how this concept of sanctity reinforces the beyond the state's gaze ratio. It gives it a moral gravity that transcends what we call positive law or man-made law.
So it's seen as something more inherent.
In this context, the right to privacy isn't seen as something that was legislated by a parliament and can therefore be taken away by a parliament. It's viewed as inherent and, in this framework, divinely ordained. This deep-seated belief system means that society itself often acts as an informal guardian of privacy.
Oh, so?
It expects and demands respect for the personal sphere, which makes any legal violation doubly offensive. It's not just a crime against the state's rules, it's a violation of a shared moral code.
And this inherent protection, it must manifest in specific cultural and moral norms around, say, entry and observation. You mentioned a concept, istizan. For a learner trying to grasp the practical weight of this cultural principle, how does istizan translate into specific legal constraints on conduct?
Istizan is a powerful concept. It literally means seeking permission. It's a foundational social and moral guideline that mandates explicit permission before you enter someone's home, and even before you seek to observe it.
So it's not just about not trespassing.
No, the purpose isn't just politeness. It's about ensuring the inhabitants are prepared for observation, protecting their dignity, and making sure they aren't caught in a vulnerable or private moment. The goal is to avoid scandal or embarrassment.
Could you give me a concrete example of how that might translate into a legal constraint in a courtroom?
Certainly. Let's imagine a common neighborhood conflict that might end up in court. A legal complaint arises not from physical trespassing, but from visual intrusion. Say, a neighbor intentionally installs a high-powered telescope or a CCTV camera and directs it specifically into your private courtyard or your garden. In a purely Western legal context, you might argue nuisance or some violation of property rights. But when the courts incorporate this principle of sanctity, they can argue that the neighbor has violated the fundamental adab, which means proper conduct and respect, by failing to seek permission to observe the private domain.
So the law is able to address the quality of the intrusion, not just the physical violation itself. It can judge the intent to intrude upon the dignity of the person.
Precisely. The concept of adab gives judges a powerful, much more nuanced tool. It means the law is highly sensitive to acts like eavesdropping or spreading rumors that were derived from private observation. It explains the cultural importance of high fences and walls. They exist because the cultural sanctity of the home prohibits unwarranted visual or auditory trespass.
And does this protection extend beyond the physical home?
It does. It applies not just to physical entry, but even to communication. The cultural expectation is that you don't read other people's private letters, you don't listen in on their conversations, and you certainly don't intercept their electronic communications without very clear legal authorization.
This sounds like a much broader protective umbrella than a simple law against trespass. It really gives the legal system a moral weight.
It absolutely does. When legal judgments draw on this principle of sanctity, they're incorporating these broader societal and moral expectations right into the legal framework, and that makes the protection far more robust. This dual layer, the legal and the moral, provides incredibly strong protection, especially in cases involving non-state actors.
And what about reputation?
Think about the implications for character and reputation, or izzat. The sanctuary of the home is where a person is most authentically themselves. Violating that space often involves a direct violation of their dignity.
I can really see how that would play out in the courtroom stories documented in the book.
Yeah.
Judges would have to be highly attuned to the social fallout of such a violation.
Yes. Cases that involve the unlawful dissemination of private material gathered from inside the home, say intimate personal photographs or private correspondence, are often treated with exceptional seriousness. The court views the breach as an attack on the moral fabric of the community itself, not just an infringement on an individual's personal space.
So the law is acting as a guardian.
The law is acting as the guardian of adab in the context of privacy. This foundational moral imperative makes the privacy right nearly unassailable. It provides an essential buffer, even when the technical legal text might be ambiguous. It offers a spiritual and cultural reason why the state must keep its gaze averted.
That gives the right a kind of timeless, non-negotiable status that, it predates any modern constitutional drafting. But while the sanctity principle deals so strongly with morality and community,
Right.
we need to transition now to how this ancient, profound principle translates onto the modern, interconnected global stage.
Right.
We're moving into the realm of privacy jurisprudence.
A crucial next step.
So if the home is the local physical red line, and sanctity is the moral amplifier for that, then privacy jurisprudence is the universal language we use to talk about that right across borders. Let's start by defining jurisprudence for the learner. We're shifting from specific local rules to the the philosophical foundations of privacy law worldwide.
Jurisprudence is essentially the philosophy, science, and study of law. So when we talk about global privacy jurisprudence, we're addressing the fundamental why this right must exist universally, and how that right should be structured and evolve, especially in response to technological change that doesn't respect national borders.
So it's about finding a global consensus.
It seeks consensus on what constitutes a fundamental, acceptable level of privacy protection for all human beings, regardless of what government they live under.
What are the key pillars that this global jurisprudence establishes? Where do these worldwide agreements begin, and how do they support that initial ratio we talked about, that the home is beyond the state's gaze?
Well, the foundation really lies in foundational international human rights instruments. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the UDHR, for example. It broadly recognizes privacy as what's called a non-derogable human right.
And non-derogable means?
It means it's inherent to human dignity, and it cannot be surrendered or arbitrarily taken away by the state. This establishes a very high international baseline standard for protection. So when a national court, like the ones documented in Mr. Mears' research, interprets its own constitutional guarantees, it will often reference this global jurisprudence to strengthen its arguments.
So global norms essentially act as a floor, a minimum standard that every nation should adhere to. They ensure that even if a local law is lagging behind or is weak, the moral and political weight of international consensus can be used by local judges to bolster protection.
That's correct. And this harmonization is absolutely crucial, especially because global jurisprudence has had to rapidly expand the definition of the private domain in ways that the ancient concept of the physical home could never fully encompass.
Right, because the threat is different now.
The modern threat to privacy rarely involves a physical trespasser anymore.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting for me. Global jurisprudence seems to acknowledge that the physical home is now paralleled by a digital home. The private domain has expanded from 4 walls to firewalls. How has this evolution been managed legally and philosophically on a global scale?
The expansion has required an analogy, one that resonates with that core ratio we started with. The private domain now includes your personal data, your location tracking, your electronic communications, your entire digital identity, your whole digital shadow.
It's all part of the home.
Global jurisprudence recognizes that these digital footprints are just as revealing, in many cases more so, than physical observation of a home. Therefore, that core ratio, the home is beyond the state's gaze, it has to be reinterpreted.
To mean what?
To mean the core intimate digital self and personal data are beyond the unauthorized gaze of the state, or just as importantly, powerful non-state actors.
Which means the battle for privacy is no longer just about someone knocking on your physical door. It's about accessing the digital contents within your devices, your cloud storage, or your communication streams.
Exactly.
And global standards must be critical here, because digital data rarely stays within one national border.
That is the immense challenge. The global nature of data flow introduces these incredibly complex questions that national law alone just cannot effectively answer. I mean, if you, the listener, are communicating with someone in another country and your data is routed through a server in a third country with lax privacy laws, which jurisdictions laws apply.
Right. It's a legal minefield.
It is. So global jurisprudence attempts to harmonize these protections. It pushes for universally accepted principles like data minimization.
Meaning you only collect what's absolutely necessary.
Yes, and purpose limitation data collected for one purpose cannot be used for another without your explicit consent, and of course strong individual consent mechanisms.
These principles sound like they're trying to regulate the massive data collection apparatus built by large corporations, not just governments.
They are, and that's a key shift. Because global jurisprudence is increasingly recognizing that large global corporations often act as quasi-state actors. Their ability to collect, process, and analyze personal data exceeds the historical power of many governments.
So the old model is insufficient.
The traditional model of privacy law, which focuses solely on constraining the state, is simply not enough anymore. Global standards, like those that underpin regulations like the GDPR in Europe, are forcing private entities to respect the same high standards of necessity and proportionality that were previously only demanded of governments.
It's fascinating how the foundational protection of the physical home, the walls, has directly informed the protection of the digital sphere, the firewall. The underlying principle is exactly the same, isn't it?
It remains the same. The individual must have an inviolable space where they can think, plan, and communicate without fear of observation, whether that space is built of brick or of code.
And this convergence is where all the constant pressure points arise, I imagine.
All of them. Global jurisprudence is continually challenging governments that seek to use vague national security exceptions to justify bulk data collection or mandated backdoors into encrypted communications. The discussion globally is always about balancing the state's legitimate security interests against the non-derogable human right to privacy.
And which way is the trend going?
The legal trend is definitively towards placing the burden of proof overwhelmingly on the state to demonstrate strict necessity and proportionality for any intrusion into this newly defined digital home.
That global pressure must profoundly influence national courts everywhere. So now that we have the legal ratio, the moral amplifier, the global philosophical framework, let's bring it all home. Let's look at how these concepts are tested in a specific national context, focusing on the constitutional application in those surveillance cases documented by Mr. Mir.
Let's do it. This is where theory meets reality.
We're transitioning now to a specific legal framework, Pakistan's Article 14 and surveillance cases, as noted in the source material. This is where the rubber really meets the road, where all this high-minded principle meets practice. So Article 14 serves as the constitutional embodiment of the principles we've been discussing, right? It applies the moral concept of sanctity and the requirements of global jurisprudence to protect individual dignity and, critically, the inviolability of the home.
That's a perfect summary. Article 14 is the domestic legal tool that operationalizes this fundamental right to privacy. The Constitution, it ensures the dignity of man, and it specifically states that the privacy of the home shall be inviolable. That language directly translates the ratio, the home is beyond the state's gaze, into enforceable constitutional law.
Which means it has real teeth.
It does. Any state action that breaches this must be justified not just by a low bar of convenience, but by the extremely high bar set by constitutional interpretation.
Okay, let's focus intensely on these surveillance cases from the True CourtRoom Stories. These cases are the battlegrounds. They represent real-world conflicts where the state, often using cutting-edge technology, is challenging that historic boundary of privacy. What kind of modern surveillance is typically being challenged under Article 14?
The challenges tend to fall into three increasingly complex categories, and they really illustrate the judicial struggle to keep pace with technology.
What's the first one?
First, you have the classic physical surveillance unauthorized entry, or maybe long-term observation using optical instruments that violate the physical space. That's the most straightforward.
Okay, and second?
Second, you have traditional electronic interception. This involves things like the wiretapping of landlines or mobile devices, which requires the court to assess the legality of the intersect order itself. Was it properly obtained? Was it too broad?
And the third category, I have to assume, involves the true modern test, dealing with data that isn't the content of a conversation, but still reveals everything about a person.
Exactly. The third category is modern data collection. This includes leveraging communication metadata, the who, when, and where of a call or message. It includes location tracking derived from mobile devices and the use of sophisticated mass surveillance tools. A notable example that comes up in courtroom research worldwide and is almost certainly reflected in Mr. Mir's cases involves the use of something called an MSI catcher.
Okay, for the listener, what exactly is an MSI catcher, and why is its use such a profound challenge to a constitutional guarantee like Article 14?
An MSI catcher, which is sometimes known by the brand name Stingray, is a device that essentially mimics a legitimate cell phone tower. It tricks all nearby mobile phones into connecting to it instead of the real network.
All of them in a given area?
All of them. And when the phones connect, the device can scoop up unique identifying numbers, the MSIs, and sometimes even data from every single user in the vicinity. Not just the suspect, everyone. It is, by its very nature, a dragnet.
I see the problem.
Its use fundamentally challenges Article 14 because it inherently violates the privacy of potentially thousands of innocent citizens simply to target one single individual.
That forces the courts, relying on Article 14, into an incredibly difficult judicial balancing act. How on earth do they weigh the state's interest in security, which, let's be honest, can be extremely high in certain regional security environments, against the fundamental, sacred right to privacy of every single individual caught in that net?
The answer, and this is critical, lies in the strict application of the principle of proportionality. This principle, which is drawn from global jurisprudence and enforced through Article 14, requires the court to evaluate the state's intrusion based on three necessary elements. If the state fails on any one of these, the action is deemed unconstitutional.
Okay, let's break those three elements of proportionality down. They sound crucial for understanding how judges review these surveillance cases.
They are. The first is suitability. The court asks a simple question. Is the surveillance method, like this MSI catcher, actually suitable for achieving the stated legitimate objective, like finding a specific criminal? If the technique is too broad or too unreliable to achieve the specific goal, it fails this first test.
So, if the government claims a surveillance method will stop a specific threat, but it's scientifically or technically just a shot in the dark, the court can block it on those grounds alone.
Precisely. The second element, and this is often the highest hurdle, is necessity. The court asks, was the state's chosen method of intrusion strictly necessary, or could the legitimate objective have been achieved through less intrusive means?
So there might have been another way.
Right. If the government could have used a traditional warrant on a specific person or targeted surveillance on a much smaller group, then the broad use of a mass tool like an MSI catcher fails the necessity test. It reinforces the idea that the state must always use the least restrictive means possible when it's impinging on fundamental rights.
That necessity test is really powerful because it forces the state to justify its choice of method, not just its objective. And what's the third element?
The third, which is often called proportionality stricto sensu, or proportionality in the strict sense, is the final balancing test. This asks whether the severity of the intrusion on the individual's right outweighs the public benefit gained by that intrusion.
Can you give an example?
In the MSI catcher example, even if the state successfully catches a dangerous criminal, which is a clear public benefit, the resulting violation of the constitutional rights of thousands of innocent people is so severe that the balance tips overwhelmingly against the state. The intrusion is deemed disproportionate to the gain.
This detailed application shows how courts translate that constitutional promise, the inviolability of dignity, into concrete protection against technologies that didn't even exist when Article 14 was written. They're essentially applying, 7th century moral principles and 20th century constitutional law to 21st century technology.
It requires immense judicial innovation and, more importantly, an unwavering adherence to that foundational ratio. For instance, courts have had to decide whether collected metadata, those patterns of life derived from digital communications, is protected under the same high standard as the actual content of the home.
And what have they decided?
Many courts, leveraging Article 14, have ruled that yes, collected metadata, when aggregated over time, reveals such intimate personal details, a comprehensive digital shadow, that it is just as protected as the physical conversations occurring within the walls of the home. The right to privacy thus evolves from being about a fixed space to being a right over one's personal information, wherever it is.
So the success of Article 14, then, it really hinges on the judicial willingness to evolve the definition of the gaze in the home to keep pace with technological advancement. They have to ensure the constitutional promise isn't hollowed out by technical loopholes or aggressive state overreach.
That's it.
The courtroom stories Mr. Mir compiled must be a chronicle of this constant, hard-fought legal evolution.
They are. Every single time a new piece of surveillance technology or a new data mining technique is introduced by law enforcement or intelligence agencies, the constitutional battle under Article 14 has to be fought all over again. The courts are the gatekeepers. They're the ones determining if the new method of observation is permissible under the strict rules of proportionality, or if it constitutes a new, unconstitutional form of state trespass into the private domain.
And the outcomes of those cases shape everything.
The outcomes of these cases shape the future of civil liberties. They define the very boundaries of the home in the modern era.
This detailed look really shows us the sheer number of layers required to protect a single, seemingly simple right, We started local with that foundational ratio, we went moral with the concept of sanctity, then we went global with jurisprudence, and finally drilled right down into the practical, complex application in these Article 14 surveillance cases.
A truly multi-layered defense.
We've completed a pretty significant conceptual journey here, covering nearly every angle of privacy documented in the source material. We started with the foundational ratio. The home is beyond the state's gaze, which sets that absolute legal bound.
The starting point.
We then saw that ratio amplified by the Islamic concept of sanctity, giving the right a deep, guiding moral and cultural grounding. We defined its philosophical bounds through global jurisprudence, ensuring the right adapts to digital life and international standards. And finally, we observed its challenging application in Article 14 in surveillance cases, where the judiciary fights to maintain that boundary against the invisible pressures of modern state technology using that strict test of proportionality.
It truly is a structure of layered defense, isn't it? You have the physical wall, the moral boundary, the international standard, and the constitutional enforcement mechanism, all designed to make the right to privacy as robust and as future-proof as possible.
So what does this all mean? At the end of the day, what's the takeaway? It means the legal battle for privacy is fundamentally about preserving the sanctity and the dignity of the self.
Absolutely.
And whether that self resides in a physical home protected by walls or in a digital domain protected by encryption and constitutional scrutiny, the principle remains exactly the same. The individual must retain a core area of autonomy, free from arbitrary or disproportionate observation.
And, our entire discussion, particularly in the context of Article 14 and the state's gaze, it all hinged on the premise that the Constitution is the primary mechanism for restraining government power.
Right.
However, this raises a really important final question for the listener to consider as they move forward with their learning. When we look at global digital life today, private corporations and non-state actors, from social media giants to massive data brokers, have access to surveillance technology and data collection capabilities that often far exceed the historical power of the state.
That's a sobering thought.
It is. So if our established legal frameworks were primarily designed to limit the state, how effectively can they really be adapted to protect the individual from these new powerful corporate gazes, which are often driven purely by profit rather than by security? The future of privacy might require a radical rethinking of who the true trespasser is and who the Constitution was originally designed to restrain.